The autumn mist rolled across the Tennessee mountains like the breath of sleeping spirits, carrying with it the weight of secrets that would soon tear through the small trading post of Millfield like wildfire. It was October 1838, and the forced removal of the Cherokee people had left scars on the land that ran deeper than any plow could reach. In the shadow of these mountains, where ancient songs once echoed through the valleys, a different kind of tragedy was about to unfold in the dusty confines of a makeshift auction house. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air hung thick with the scent of wood smoke and human desperation, while the sound of hammering echoed from the hastily constructed platform where lives would be bought and sold like cattle. Few people understood that some stories begin not with hope, but with the complete absence of it, and fewer still realized that the most powerful transformations often spring from the deepest wells of human suffering. Sarah Blackbird stood in the cramped holding area behind the auction platform, her dark eyes fixed on a knot in the wooden wall as if she could will herself to disappear through its rough surface. At 19 years old, she had already witnessed more loss and betrayal than most people would experience in several lifetimes. Her fingers traced the worn leather cord around her neck, hidden beneath the coarse fabric of the simple dress they had given her to replace her traditional clothing. The cord held the only thing of value she had left in this world, a small piece of carved bone that had belonged to her grandmother, inscribed with symbols that told the story of her true lineage. But Sarah had learned long ago that speaking of such things only brought more pain, more questions she could not safely answer, and more attention from people who saw her heritage as either a curiosity or a threat. She had been born Sarah Raven Feather, daughter of Joseph Blackbird, a Cherokee leader who had fought desperately to keep his people on their ancestral lands when the soldiers came with their papers and their promises of new territory in the West. Her mother, Mary Singing Brook, had been known throughout their nation as a healer whose knowledge of ancient medicines had saved countless lives during the harsh winters that preceded their forced removal. But Sarah no longer spoke those names aloud, no longer claimed the heritage that had once filled her with pride. The world had made it clear that being Cherokee was something to be ashamed of, something to be hidden or eliminated entirely. The trail of tears had scattered her people like leaves before a hurricane, and those who remained in the eastern mountains did so by pretending to be something they were not. The journey that had brought Sarah to this moment began 3 years earlier when soldiers arrived at their hidden village in the remote hollows of the Smoky Mountains. Her father had believed they were safe there, protected by the difficult terrain, and the sympathetic white families who had helped conceal their presence. He had been wrong about many things, but his greatest mistake had been trusting Thomas Morrison, a local trader who had claimed friendship while secretly reporting their location to the authorities. Sarah remembered the morning the soldiers came, as if it had happened yesterday rather than 3 years ago. She had been gathering medicinal herbs with her mother in the forest when they heard the shouting and the sound of horses crashing through the underbrush. By the time they reached the village, half the houses were already burning and the men were being forced into chains at gunpoint. Her father had looked at her across the chaos of that terrible morning and spoken a single word in Cherokee, a word that meant run. Sarah had grabbed her mother's hand and they had fled into the deep woods, following trails that only the Cherokee knew, moving like shadows through terrain that had sheltered their ancestors for thousands of years. For 2 years they had lived as fugitives, surviving on whatever food they could gather or steal, sleeping in caves and abandoned cabins, always moving, always listening for the sound of pursuit. Her mother had grown weaker with each passing month, the harsh conditions and constant stress taking a toll on her health that all her knowledge of healing could not reverse. When Mary Singing Brook finally died in Sarah's arms during a bitter February storm, she had used her last breath to whisper instructions that would haunt her daughter forever. She told Sarah to forget her Cherokee name, to forget their language, to forget everything that connected her to their people. Only by becoming invisible could she hope to survive in a world that had declared war on everything she represented. Sarah had buried her mother in a grove of ancient oaks, marking the grave with stones arranged in a pattern that only other Cherokee would recognize. Then she had walked down from the mountains and into the world of white settlements, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the carved bone that held the secret of who she really was. For the past year, she had worked as a servant in the household of Judge Harold Whitmore, a man who prided himself on his progressive views while treating the people who served him like property. Sarah had scrubbed his floors, cooked his meals, and endured his wife's constant criticism, while pretending to be nothing more than a simple mountain girl grateful for steady work. The arrangement had worked well enough until 3 weeks ago, when Judge Whitmore's eldest son had returned from college with new ideas about how the household should be managed. Robert Whitmore had taken one look at Sarah and decided that her services could be expanded beyond cooking and cleaning. When she refused his advances, he had accused her of theft, claiming that valuable items had gone missing from his room. Sarah knew that protesting her innocence would accomplish nothing. She had seen what happened to servants who challenged the word of their employers, especially when those servants had no family or connections to speak for them. Judge Whitmore had listened to his son's accusations with the same cold detachment he brought to his courtroom, and within hours Sarah had found herself in the local jail awaiting trial for crimes she had not committed. The trial, if it could be called that, had lasted less than an hour. Judge Whitmore had recused himself to avoid the appearance of impropriety, but his replacement was a man who owed his position to Whitmore's political influence. Sarah had no lawyer, no witnesses to speak on her behalf, and no way to prove her innocence against the testimony of a respected family. The sentence had been swift and devastating. Rather than sending her to prison, the judge had ruled that Sarah would be sold at public auction to repay the value of the supposedly stolen items plus court costs. It was a common practice in cases involving servants and laborers who could not pay their debts, a legal form of slavery that allowed respectable people to profit from human misery while maintaining the fiction that they were upholding justice. Now Sarah stood behind the auction platform, listening to the growing crowd outside as buyers gathered to examine the human merchandise that would soon be offered for sale. She could hear their voices discussing her as if she were livestock, speculating about her age, her health, her capacity for work, and her likely selling price. Most of the conversation focused on practical matters, the kind of labor she might be suited for, the length of her indenture, and the legal requirements for maintaining indentured servants. But Sarah also caught fragments of darker discussions, whispered comments about her appearance, and suggestions about additional services she might be required to provide. The auctioneer was a man named Ezra Cobb, and his blindness was both a blessing and a curse for the people he sold. Unable to see their faces, he could not be influenced by tears or expressions of despair, but he also could not witness the cruelty and degradation that often accompanied his work. Sarah had heard that Cobb had lost his sight in a mining accident years earlier, and that conducting auctions was one of the few jobs available to a blind man in a society that had little use for the disabled. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the morning progressed, Sarah listened to Cobb selling furniture, livestock, and farm equipment with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to conduct business through sound and touch alone. His voice carried clearly across the auction yard as he described each item and encouraged competitive bidding from the assembled crowd. When the time came for Sarah to be brought forward, 2 men escorted her through a side door and onto the platform where Ezra Cobb waited with his wooden gavel and leather-bound ledger. The crowd fell silent as she appeared, and Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of eyes examining every detail of her appearance. Cobb's voice cut through the morning air with professional detachment as he began his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, we now offer for your consideration a young woman of approximately 19 years, healthy and capable, sentenced to indentured servitude for a period of 7 years to satisfy debts incurred through criminal conviction. The description continued with details about her supposed crimes, her physical condition, and the terms of her indenture. Sarah stood motionless throughout the recitation, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains where her people had once lived. Freely, where her parents were buried, where everything she had ever loved had been destroyed or scattered to the winds. The bidding began slowly, with several local farmers expressing mild interest in acquiring additional labor for their households. The amounts being offered were insultingly low, reflecting both the buyer's desire for bargains and their assessment of Sarah's value as property. She was, after all, just another displaced person in a region full of displaced people, notable only for her youth and apparent health. As the auction progressed, Sarah began to understand that she was witnessing her own destruction in the most literal sense possible. Whoever purchased her indenture would own 7 years of her life, 7 years during which she would have no legal rights, no protection from abuse, and no hope of escape. She would be property in everything but name, and at the end of those 7 years, she would be released into a world that would still see her as nothing more than a former convict with no family, no resources, and no future. The thought of spending 7 years as the property of men like those bidding on her filled Sarah with a despair so deep, it felt like drowning. She had survived the destruction of her people, the death of her parents, and 3 years of desperate poverty. But the idea of being owned by strangers who saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used and discarded threatened to break something inside her that had somehow remained intact through all her previous suffering. The bidding had reached $12 when something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the crowd called out a bid so low that it initially caused confusion among the assembled buyers. $1, the voice said clearly, cutting through the competitive murmur of higher offers. The crowd turned to see who had made such an absurdly low bid, and Sarah found herself looking at a man unlike any other she had seen in the settlements. He was tall and weathered, with long gray hair tied back in a simple leather cord and clothing that marked him as someone who spent most of his time in the wilderness rather than in towns. His face was deeply lined by exposure to sun and wind, but his eyes held a clarity and intelligence that seemed out of place among the crude farmers and merchants who made up the rest of the auction crowd. "I believe there's been a mistake," Ezra Cobb said, his blind eyes turning toward the sound of the voice. "The current bid is $12, not $1. "I heard the other bids," the stranger replied calmly. "My bid is $1, and I'm prepared to pay it immediately." The crowd began to murmur with confusion and amusement. Some of the other bidders seemed insulted by the implication that their offers could be superseded by such a trivial amount, while others appeared curious about the stranger's motives. A few laughed outright at what they assumed was either a joke or the confused ramblings of an old mountain man who didn't understand how auctions worked. Ezra Cobb tried to maintain order while explaining the basic principles of competitive bidding. "Sir, you cannot simply override higher bids with a lower offer. The current bid stands at $12, and any new bid must exceed that amount." The stranger stepped forward through the crowd, moving with the confident ease of someone accustomed to being noticed and respected. As he approached the platform, Sarah could see that he carried himself with a dignity that seemed to command attention even from people who had initially dismissed him as irrelevant. "I understand how auctions work," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that caused the crowd to fall silent. "But I believe there may be special circumstances that apply to this particular case." Cobb's confusion was evident in his voice. What circumstances could possibly justify accepting a $1 bid when higher amounts have been offered? The stranger had reached the base of the platform now, close enough that Sarah could see his face clearly. There was something in his expression that suggested he knew more about her situation than a casual observer should know. And when his eyes met hers, she felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with having seen him before. "I believe," the stranger said slowly, "that this young woman should be given the opportunity to speak for herself before any final decisions are made. Perhaps she has something to say about who she is and where she comes from." The suggestion caused an immediate uproar among the crowd. The idea that an indentured servant should have any say in determining her own fate was so radical that many of the assembled buyers began shouting protests before the stranger had finished speaking. In their world, people who were being sold at auction were property, not individuals with rights or opinions worth considering. Ezra Cobb raised his gavel for silence, clearly struggling to maintain control of a situation that had moved far beyond his experience. "Sir, while I appreciate your concern for proper procedure, the young woman's personal preferences are not relevant to this legal proceeding. She has been sentenced to indentured servitude, and my job is simply to conduct the sale according to established law." "And what if the law is based on false information?" the stranger asked. "What if this young woman is not who you think she is?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that no one in the crowd fully understood, but everyone seemed to sense were significant. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she realized that somehow, impossibly, the stranger knew something about her true identity. For 3 years, she had followed her mother's dying instructions to hide everything that connected her to her Cherokee heritage. She had spoken only English, claimed no family connections, and allowed people to assume she was nothing more than a displaced mountain girl with no significant background. The strategy had kept her alive, but it had also erased her identity so completely that sometimes she wondered if Sarah Raven Feather had ever really existed. Now this stranger was suggesting her carefully constructed anonymity might be about to collapse, and Sarah found herself torn between terror and hope. If her true identity was revealed, it could mean imprisonment or worse for violating the laws that prohibited Cherokee people from remaining in their ancestral territories. But it might also mean an end to the isolation and powerlessness that had defined her life since her mother's death. Ezra Cobb was clearly at a loss for how to proceed. The auction had devolved into something far outside his normal experience, and the crowd was growing restless with impatience and confusion. Some buyers were demanding that the sale continue according to normal procedures, while others seemed curious about what revelations the stranger might be preparing to share. "Young woman," Cobb finally said, turning his blind eyes towards Sarah's position on the platform, "do you have something to say about your identity that might be relevant to these proceedings?" Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of eyes focused on her as she struggled to find words for a moment that would define the rest of her life. For 3 years, she had survived by remaining silent, by allowing others to define who she was and what she was worth. Now she was being asked to speak for herself, to claim an identity that had been stripped away by force and hidden by necessity. The carved bone pendant beneath her dress seemed to burn against her skin as she thought of her grandmother's stories about the power of names, about the belief that speaking someone's true name could summon their ancestors and their spirit helpers. Her mother had warned her never to speak her Cherokee name aloud, but her mother had also raised her to believe that some truths were more important than safety. Sarah took a deep breath and felt something shift inside her chest, as if a door that had been locked for years was finally beginning to open. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the silent auction yard, and every word seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. "My name," she said, "is not Sarah. My name is Raven Feather Blackbird, daughter of Joseph Blackbird and Mary Singing Brook of the Cherokee Nation." The effect of her words was immediate and electric. The crowd erupted in shocked exclamations as people tried to process what they had just heard. Some buyers began backing away from the platform, as if her Cherokee identity might be contagious, while others pressed forward with expressions of curiosity or hostility. But Sarah's attention was focused entirely on the stranger who had somehow known to ask the right question at the right moment. He was looking at her with an expression of deep satisfaction, as if a puzzle he had been working on for years had finally been solved. "And who?" Ezra Cobb asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you to know that this young woman should speak her true name?" The stranger smiled for the first time since Sarah had noticed him, and when he answered, his voice carried the weight of authority that came from speaking absolute truth. "My name is William Standing Bear, and I have been searching for Joseph Blackbird's daughter for 3 years, ever since her father asked me to watch over her if anything happened to him." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. William Standing Bear was a name she knew well from her childhood. A Cherokee leader who had worked closely with her father in the desperate years before their removal. She had assumed he was dead or scattered to the Western Territories like so many others, but here he stood in the middle of a white settlement, claiming responsibility for her welfare. The crowd's reaction to William's revelation was even more dramatic than their response to Sarah's true name. Several men began shouting about the illegality of Cherokee people remaining in Tennessee, while others demanded to know how 2 Indians had managed to infiltrate their community without detection. Ezra Cobb seemed completely overwhelmed by the turn of events. His auction had transformed into something resembling a diplomatic crisis, and he clearly had no idea how to proceed. The legal framework for selling indentured servants made no provision for cases involving people whose very presence in the territory might be illegal. "This auction is suspended," Cobb announced, his voice shaking with uncertainty. "I need to consult with legal authorities before proceeding further." But William Standing Bear raised his hand for attention, and somehow his gesture commanded enough respect to quiet the agitated crowd. "There will be no need for legal consultation," he said calmly. "I am prepared to pay the $1 bid I offered, and then this young woman will be coming with me." "You can't just take her," someone shouted from the crowd. "She's been sentenced by a legitimate court." "Has she?" William asked, his voice carrying a challenge that made several people step back. "Or has she been convicted under a false identity by people who had no legal authority to try a Cherokee citizen?" The question revealed the complexity of Sarah's legal situation in ways that no one had previously considered. If she was indeed Cherokee, her case fell under federal jurisdiction rather than local courts. The legal framework that had been used to convict and sentence her might have no validity whatsoever. More importantly, Sarah was beginning to understand that William Standing Bear had not arrived at this auction by accident. He had been tracking her, waiting for the right moment to intervene, and now he was prepared to use legal technicalities and political pressure to secure her freedom. "Furthermore," William continued, "I should mention that Miss Blackbird's father was not just any Cherokee leader. Joseph Blackbird was a principal chief, and his daughter's treatment under local law represents a violation of several federal treaties." The crowd's mood was shifting from curiosity to alarm as people began to understand the potential consequences of having illegally convicted and auctioned the daughter of a Cherokee chief. Federal authorities took treaty violations seriously, and the political ramifications of this case could extend far beyond the local community. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that her long exile was about to end. For 3 years, she had believed herself to be completely alone in the world, the last surviving member of a family that had been destroyed by forces beyond their control. Now she was learning that her father's friends had never stopped searching for her, that she was still part of a community that valued her life and her heritage. William reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch from which he counted out 4 quarters and placed them on the auction platform. $1, he announced. Payment in full for the release of Raven Feather Blackbird to the custody of her father's appointed guardian. Ezra Cobb reached out with trembling hands to feel the coins, his blind fingers confirming their reality. The legal complexity of the situation was clearly beyond his expertise, but the physical presence of payment according to the terms he had announced made it difficult for him to refuse the transaction. "I suppose," he said hesitantly, "if no one is prepared to offer a higher bid, and if the payment is legitimate." "The payment is legitimate," William said firmly, "and I can assure you that any attempt to interfere with this transaction will result in federal intervention that no one in this community will find pleasant." The threat was delivered so calmly that it took several seconds for its full meaning to register with the crowd. William Standing Bear was not just rescuing Sarah from an illegal auction. He was making it clear that continued harassment of Cherokee people in the region would have serious consequences. Sarah stepped down from the platform on legs that felt like water, her entire world transformed in the space of a few minutes. As she approached William, he held out his hand to her with the gentle smile of a man greeting a long-lost daughter. "Your father would be proud of how you survived," he said softly. "And your mother's teachings about hiding in plain sight may have saved your life." The crowd was beginning to disperse, some people clearly eager to distance themselves from the situation that had become politically dangerous. Others lingered, watching with fascination as the Cherokee man and woman prepared to leave their community. Together, as Sarah and William walked away from the auction platform, she felt the carved bone pendant beneath her dress and realized that she was no longer hiding who she was. For the first time in 3 years, she could speak her real name, claim her heritage, and connect with people who understood her true value. But even as relief flooded through her system, Sarah was aware that their escape from Millfield was only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous journey. William's intervention had saved her from 7 years of indentured servitude, but it had also revealed the presence of Cherokee people in a region where their very existence was illegal. The mountains that surrounded the trading post suddenly seemed less like protective barriers and more like the walls of a trap that was about to close around them. Sarah had been rescued, but she was not yet safe, and the true test of their survival was just beginning. The walk away from the auction platform felt like emerging from a tomb into sunlight, though Sarah knew their danger had only begun to take shape. William Standing Bear moved with the measured pace of a man who understood that appearing desperate would only invite pursuit, but Sarah could sense the urgency beneath his calm exterior. Every step carried them further from the legal protection of the white settlement and deeper into territory where their very presence could mean death. As they reached the edge of Millfield, William led Sarah toward a grove of oak trees where 2 horses waited with the patient stillness of well-trained animals. The horses were saddled and ready for immediate departure, confirming Sarah's growing suspicion that William's appearance at the auction had been carefully planned rather than fortunate coincidence. "How long have you been watching me?" Sarah asked as William helped her mount the smaller of the 2 horses. Her voice carried a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment at the realization that she had not been as alone as she had believed. 3 months, William replied, swinging easily onto his own mount, despite his apparent age. "Ever since Martha Cooper mentioned seeing a Cherokee girl working at the Whitmore house. It took time to confirm your identity and develop a plan that wouldn't get us both killed." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air as she realized how exposed she had been without knowing it. If William had been able to identify her, others might have done the same. The safety she had felt in her anonymity had been an illusion, and she wondered how many other people had suspected her true heritage. They rode in silence for the first hour, following deer trails and abandoned logging roads that kept them away from the main routes where travelers might report their passage to authorities. William seemed to know the terrain intimately, guiding them through valleys and across ridges with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning every hidden path through the mountains. The autumn forest blazed with colors that reminded Sarah of her childhood, when she had walked these same mountains with her parents during their seasonal migrations between winter and summer camps. The familiar sights and smells triggered memories she had tried to suppress for 3 years, and she found herself fighting back tears as she remembered a time when being Cherokee had meant pride rather than terror. When they finally stopped to rest the horses beside a small mountain stream, William turned to face Sarah with an expression that mixed relief with deep concern. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said. "Your rescue from that auction was only the first step in a much more complicated journey." Sarah dismounted and led her horse to the water, using the time to gather her thoughts. For 3 years, she had focused entirely on simple survival, on making it through each day without being discovered or destroyed. The idea of planning for a future beyond mere existence felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "Where can we go?" she asked finally. "The removal is complete. Our people are scattered across the Western Territories, if they're still alive at all." William's smile held a sadness that spoke of losses Sarah could only imagine. "Not all of our people accepted removal," he said quietly. "Small groups remain hidden throughout these mountains, and there are others who have found ways to live in the white world without abandoning their Cherokee identity entirely." The revelation that other Cherokee people still lived in their ancestral territory filled Sarah with a hope she had not dared to feel since her mother's death. But it also raised questions about why she had spent 3 years believing herself to be completely alone. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" she asked, unable to keep the accusation out of her voice. "I nearly starved to death 2 winters ago. I've been living like a ghost, afraid to speak my own language or remember my own name." William's expression darkened with what might have been guilt or regret. "Finding you sooner would have meant exposing the entire network of hidden communities," he explained. "Every Cherokee who remains in these mountains lives under constant threat of discovery. We move carefully and we don't take risks unless absolutely necessary. And my situation at the Whitmore house wasn't absolutely necessary." Sarah's anger was building as she thought about the months of degradation and fear she had endured, while help remained tantalizingly close. "We were planning to extract you from the Whitmore household," William said firmly. "But when young Robert Whitmore accused you of theft, everything accelerated beyond our control. The auction gave us an opportunity we couldn't have created through more subtle means." Sarah stared at him, processing the implications of his words. "You're saying the false accusations were actually helpful?" "I'm saying that sometimes survival requires accepting help from unexpected sources, even when that help comes at a terrible cost," William replied. "Your public identification as Cherokee has complicated everything, but it has also freed you from the need to hide your true nature." The complexity of her situation was beginning to dawn on Sarah. By speaking her real name at the auction, she had destroyed the anonymity that had protected her for 3 years. But she had also reconnected with her heritage and her people in a way that might offer possibilities she had never imagined. They remounted and continued their journey deeper into the mountains, climbing toward elevations where the air grew thin and the trails became increasingly treacherous. William's knowledge of the terrain remained impressive, but Sarah began to notice signs that they were not traveling entirely unobserved. Scratches on tree bark that might have been made by animals but followed patterns too regular to be natural. Stones arranged beside the trail in configurations that suggested human placement. Most telling of all, the complete absence of wildlife in areas where deer and birds should have been abundant. "We're being watched," Sarah said during their second rest stop. She kept her voice low and tried to appear casual as she examined their surroundings. William nodded approvingly. "You notice quickly. That's good. Your survival over the past 3 years wasn't just luck." "Who's watching us?" Sarah asked, though part of her had already guessed the answer. "Cherokee scouts," William confirmed. "They've been tracking our progress since we left Millfield." By now, everyone in the hidden communities knows about your rescue and your true identity. The idea that Cherokee people were still organized enough to maintain scouts and communication networks filled Sarah with amazement and renewed hope. She had assumed that the forced removal had completely shattered their society, but apparently some structures had survived and adapted to their new circumstances. As afternoon faded toward evening, they began to encounter more obvious signs of human presence. A well-maintained but nearly invisible trail branched off from the deer path they had been following. Smoke from carefully hidden cooking fires drifted through the trees. Most remarkably, Sarah heard the distant sound of someone singing in Cherokee. The first time she had heard her native language spoken aloud in 3 years, the sound of Cherokee. Words being sung freely in the mountains where her people had always lived brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She had dreamed of this moment during her darkest hours, but had never quite believed it could happen. The melody was one her grandmother had taught her as a child, a song about the eternal connection between the Cherokee people and the land that had given them birth. "Welcome home," William said softly. Noticing her emotional response to the singing, they rode toward the source of the music, following a trail that seemed to appear out of the forest floor as they approached. The hidden community that emerged from the trees was unlike anything Sarah had expected to find. Rather than a traditional Cherokee village, what she saw was a carefully camouflaged settlement that blended native and white building styles and ways, designed to minimize its visibility from a distance. Log cabins were built into natural depressions and against rock formations that would hide them from overhead observation. Gardens were planted in scattered plots that would appear to be natural clearings rather than cultivated fields. Most importantly, the people she saw moving through the settlement appeared to be living normal lives, rather than cowering in constant fear of discovery. Children played games that had been passed down through generations of Cherokee families. Women worked at traditional crafts while discussing community matters in their native language. Men maintained weapons and discussed hunting strategies. With the calm confidence of people who felt secure in their environment. As Sarah and William rode into the settlement, people began to emerge from their homes and work areas to get a better look at the newcomers. Sarah felt the weight of their attention, but it was entirely different from the hostile scrutiny she had endured at the auction. These people were examining her with curiosity and welcome, rather than judgment and calculation. An elderly woman approached them as they dismounted, and Sarah immediately recognized something familiar in her bearing and appearance. She moved with the dignity that came from being a respected leader, and her eyes held the wisdom that Cherokee communities had always valued in their elders. "Raven Feather Blackbird," the woman said, using Sarah's Cherokee name with a naturalness that made her heart sing. "I am Nancy Ridge Walker, and I knew your grandmother before the troubles began." Sarah felt her knees go weak as she realized she was meeting someone who had known her family during the time when they had lived freely in their ancestral territory. Nancy Ridge Walker represented a direct connection to the life that had been stolen from her, and her presence proved that not everything from the old days had been lost forever. "My grandmother spoke of you," Sarah managed to say, searching her memory for stories she had been told as a child. "You were the one who taught her about the healing properties of mountain laurel." Nancy's smile confirmed that Sarah's memory was accurate. "And she taught me about the songs that call rain during drought seasons." Knowledge shared between friends creates bonds that even removal cannot break. The older woman gestured toward a large cabin that appeared to serve as some kind of community center. "Come, there are others here who knew your family, and we have much to discuss about your future." As they walked toward the cabin, Sarah noticed that the settlement was larger than it had first appeared. Additional buildings were hidden among the trees, and paths led away toward what might have been satellite communities or resource areas. The hidden Cherokee presence in these mountains was apparently more extensive and better organized than she had dared to imagine. The interior of the community cabin was warm and welcoming, with a large stone fireplace providing both heat and light for the gathering space. Traditional Cherokee decorative elements, blended with practical furnishings in ways that honored their heritage while acknowledging their need to remain hidden from hostile authorities. Around the fireplace sat a group of about 15 adults, both men and women, who appeared to represent the leadership of the hidden community. Sarah recognized the dynamics immediately from her childhood memories of tribal councils, where important decisions were made through careful discussion and consensus building rather than autocratic decree. "Sit," Nancy said, indicating a place near the fire where Sarah would be visible to everyone present. "Tonight we must decide how to protect you and whether your presence here endangers everyone else." The blunt statement reminded Sarah that her rescue had created new problems as well as solving old ones. Her public identification as Cherokee at the auction had made her a target for authorities, who were already suspicious about the possible presence of remaining Native people in the region. An older man with graying hair and scars that suggested a warrior's background leaned forward to address her directly. "I am Thomas Crow Killer, and I served with your father during the resistance years. Tell us about your time in the white settlements. What did you learn about their plans for finding and removing the rest of us?" Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount her 3 years of hiding, working to remember details that might be useful for the community's security. She described the attitudes she had encountered toward Cherokee people, the legal mechanisms used to justify continued persecution, and the economic incentives that motivated some whites to cooperate with removal policies. Most importantly, she shared what she had learned about the methods authorities used to identify Cherokee people who were trying to pass as white or mixed-race settlers. Physical appearance was less important than behavior patterns, language usage, and cultural knowledge that marked someone as having been raised in Cherokee communities. "The Whitmore family suspected nothing until Robert Whitmore decided to assault me," Sarah concluded. "My disguise was effective as long as I remained invisible and submissive. The danger came when I had to choose between maintaining my cover and protecting myself." Thomas nodded approvingly. "You chose correctly. Survival without honor is not survival at all." A middle-aged woman named Susan Climbing Bear raised concerns about the broader implications of Sarah's rescue. "William's intervention at the auction was brave and necessary, but it has revealed our presence to people who will certainly report what they witnessed to territorial authorities. We must assume that within days, soldiers will be searching these mountains for Cherokee communities." The observation cast a shadow over the warm welcome Sarah had been receiving. Her rescue had been a wonderful thing for her personally, but it might have doomed the people who had saved her. The community had been living safely in secret for months or years, and now their security was compromised because they had chosen to help her. "I should leave," Sarah said quietly. "I can disappear again, make my way west to the removal territories. You shouldn't have to pay for my mistakes." "No," William said firmly. "Running away again would solve nothing and waste the risks we've already taken. We need to find a different solution." Nancy Ridge Walker stood and moved to a wooden chest from which she retrieved a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "Perhaps it is time to consider options we have been avoiding," she said, unwrapping what appeared to be several official-looking documents. "What are those?" Sarah asked, though something about the papers seemed familiar. "Marriage certificates," Nancy replied, "and adoption papers, and military service records. Documents that can transform Cherokee people into legal white citizens if used properly." Sarah stared at the papers, beginning to understand the implications of what Nancy was suggesting. "Forged documents?" "Not forged," William corrected. "Legitimate papers obtained through bribes, favors, and careful manipulation of bureaucratic systems. We've been building a collection of legal identities for emergency use." Thomas Crow Killer explained the strategy that had been developing over months of careful planning. If Cherokee people cannot exist legally in Tennessee, then Cherokee people must become white people, at least on paper. The documents Nancy has assembled would allow several families to relocate to other states where their past could not be investigated. The plan was ingenious in its simplicity, but Sarah could see the enormous risks involved. Using false documents to claim white identity was a capital crime, and discovery would mean death for everyone involved. More troubling from a cultural perspective, it would require Cherokee people to permanently abandon their tribal connections and spend the rest of their lives pretending to be something they were not. "What about the children?" Sarah asked. "How can you teach them their heritage if they must always pretend to be white?" Susan Climbing Bear smiled sadly. "We teach them in secret, the same way our grandmothers taught us to remember the old stories when the missionaries tried to destroy our traditions. Knowledge finds a way to survive if people are determined to preserve it." The discussion continued deep into the night as the community leaders debated the various options available to them. Some favored immediate evacuation to the western territories, arguing that trying to remain in Tennessee had become impossibly dangerous. Others supported the document strategy, believing that integration into white society offered the best long-term protection for Cherokee families. A third faction advocated for a more militant approach, suggesting that the time had come to abandon hiding and openly resist further removal efforts. This group pointed out that Cherokee people had legitimate legal claims to their ancestral territory, and that federal treaties theoretically protected their rights, even if local authorities chose to ignore those protections. As Sarah listened to the debate, she began to understand that her rescue had forced the community to confront questions they had been avoiding for months. Her presence among them was a catalyst that would determine their collective future, whether they chose to continue hiding, attempt integration, or embrace open resistance. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. 3 days ago, she had been a powerless servant facing 7 years of indentured servitude. Now she was somehow at the center of decisions that would affect the survival of dozens of Cherokee families. When Nancy finally called for an end to the evening's discussion, no consensus had been reached about the community's future direction. But Sarah had learned enough about her new circumstances to understand that her old life was truly over. Whether she stayed with the hidden community or traveled elsewhere, she would never again be the isolated and anonymous person she had been since her mother's death. As people began to disperse to their homes, William approached Sarah with an expression that suggested he had something important to say. "There's one more thing you need to know," he said quietly. "Your father is alive." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. For 3 years, she had believed that Joseph Blackbird had died during the forced removal, probably killed while trying to protect other Cherokee families from the soldiers. The possibility that he might still be alive had never occurred to her. "Where?" she whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow make the news less real. "Oklahoma Territory," William replied. "He's working with other Cherokee leaders to establish a new tribal government in the western lands. He doesn't know you're alive either." Communication between the hidden communities and the removal territories is almost impossible. The revelation that her father was alive changed everything Sarah thought she understood about her situation. She was no longer the last surviving member of her family, no longer completely alone in the world. But she was also faced with the possibility of reuniting with her father after years of separation and grief. "Can I reach him?" she asked. "Is there a way to get word to him?" William's expression was grave. "The journey to Oklahoma Territory is dangerous under the best circumstances. For someone who has been publicly identified as Cherokee in Tennessee, it would be almost certainly fatal." Sarah felt hope and despair warring in her chest as she processed the implications of William's words. Her father was alive, but reaching him might be impossible. She had found a community of Cherokee people who welcomed her, but staying with them might endanger everyone. She had legal papers that could give her a new identity, but using them would require abandoning her heritage permanently. The choices ahead of her were all difficult, and each one carried risks that could result in death or permanent separation from everything she valued. But for the first time in 3 years, she was surrounded by people who understood her situation and supported her right to make her own decisions about her future. As Sarah settled into the small cabin that had been prepared for her use, she reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in a single day. This morning, she had been property being sold at auction. Tonight, she was a free woman sleeping in a Cherokee community where her real name was known and honored. The transformation was so complete that it felt like waking from a 3-year nightmare into a reality she had never dared to imagine. But she was also aware that the most difficult challenges still lay ahead, and that the choices she made in the coming days would determine not only her own fate, but the survival of an entire community. Outside her cabin window, she could hear the soft sounds of Cherokee people living their lives in freedom, however precarious that freedom might be. Children whispered to each other in their native language. Adults discussed the day's work and tomorrow's plans. Somewhere in the distance, someone was singing the old songs that connected them to their ancestors and their land. For the first time since her mother's death, Sarah Raven-Feather Blackbird fell asleep surrounded by the sounds of her own people, in the mountains where her grandmothers had been born, with the knowledge that she was no longer alone in the world. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, tonight she was home. The first light of dawn filtered through the dense canopy of ancient oak surrounding the hidden Cherokee settlement, casting intricate patterns of gold and shadow across the forest floor. Sarah woke to the sound of voices speaking in Cherokee, a melody of conversation that had become the soundtrack of dreams she had not dared to remember for 3 years. The simple pleasure of hearing her native language spoken freely filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the wool blankets wrapped around her shoulders. Rising from her narrow bed, Sarah moved to the single window of her cabin and looked out at a community coming to life in the early morning hours. Children emerged from their homes with the eager energy of young people who felt safe enough to run and play without constantly looking over their shoulders. Women gathered at the central well to collect water and exchange the kind of casual conversation that built the social fabric of any healthy community. Men checked their weapons and discussed the day's hunting plans with the calm confidence of people who understood their environment completely. The normalcy of the scene was almost overwhelming for someone who had spent 3 years believing that Cherokee communities no longer existed anywhere in their ancestral territory. Sarah had awakened expecting to discover that the previous day's events had been an elaborate dream, but the evidence of her senses confirmed that she had indeed found her way back to her people. A soft knock at her door interrupted her observations, and Sarah opened it to find a young woman about her own age holding a bundle of clothes and a basin of warm water. The visitor had the dark hair and distinctive features that marked her as Cherokee, but her clothing was a careful blend of traditional and white styles that would allow her to pass for a mixed-race settler if questioned by authorities. "Good morning," the young woman said in Cherokee, her voice carrying the musical tones that Sarah remembered from her childhood. "I'm Rebecca Turtle Dove. Nancy Ridge Walker asked me to bring you these things and to help you prepare for the day ahead." Sarah accepted the offered items gratefully, realizing that her own clothes bore the stains and wear of yesterday's dramatic events. The garments Rebecca had brought were similar to her own outfit, designed to appear unremarkable to casual observation while incorporating subtle elements that honored Cherokee traditions. "Thank you," Sarah replied, also speaking in Cherokee for the first time in years. The words felt strange in her mouth after so long speaking only English, but they also felt like coming home to a part of herself that had been locked away. "It's been a long time since anyone has shown me such kindness." Rebecca's smile carried understanding that went beyond her years. All of us here know what it means to be separated from family and community. We take care of each other because we understand how precious it is to have people who share your struggles. As Sarah washed and changed into the clean clothes, Rebecca explained the daily routines and expectations of the hidden settlement. Everyone contributed to the community's survival through work that was carefully organized to minimize their visibility to the outside world. Hunting and gathering were conducted by small groups that moved like ghosts through the forest, taking only what they needed and leaving no traces that might attract unwanted attention. The community's agriculture was particularly ingenious, consisting of small scattered plots that appeared to be natural clearings rather than cultivated fields. Each family maintained several of these hidden gardens, growing traditional Cherokee crops like corn, beans, and squash alongside wild plants that would camouflage their farming activities. The most important thing to remember, Rebecca explained, as they walked toward the community's central gathering area, is that we survive by being invisible. Everything we do must appear natural to anyone who might be watching from a distance. Sarah nodded, understanding immediately how different this community's survival strategy was from her own approach over the past 3 years, where she had tried to disappear by becoming someone else entirely. These people had found ways to remain Cherokee while hiding in plain sight. The central gathering area was dominated by a large fire pit surrounded by logs arranged to provide seating for community meetings. This morning, about 30 people had assembled for what appeared to be a combination of breakfast and planning session. Sarah recognized many faces from the previous night's discussion, but she also saw Cherokee families she had not yet met. Nancy Ridge Walker gestured for Sarah to join her near the fire, where several of the community's elders had gathered to continue the previous night's conversation about their collective future. The warm greetings Sarah received confirmed that her presence was welcome, but she could also sense the underlying tension that came from knowing their security had been compromised. "We have been discussing the practical implications of yesterday's events," Nancy began, her voice carrying the authority that came from being a respected leader. "Word of your rescue has already reached other hidden communities throughout these mountains, and everyone is asking the same questions about what comes next." Thomas Crow Killer leaned forward to address Sarah directly. The auction in Millfield was witnessed by over 200 people, including several who have connections to territorial authorities. "We must assume that within days, soldiers will be combing these mountains looking for Cherokee settlements." The stark assessment of their danger sent a chill through Sarah's chest. She had known that her rescue would have consequences, but hearing the timeline spelled out so clearly made the threat feel immediate and personal. The people who had saved her were now facing potential death or deportation because they had chosen to help her. "What can I do to help?" Sarah asked, determined not to be a passive burden on people who were risking everything for her welfare. "I've learned things about white settlements and authorities that might be useful for planning our response." William Standing Bear, who had been listening quietly to the discussion, spoke up for the first time. "Your knowledge of how white communities operate will indeed be valuable. But first, we need to determine whether you're committed to staying with us, or whether you plan to attempt the journey to Oklahoma Territory to reunite with your father." The question struck at the heart of Sarah's internal conflict. Learning that her father was alive had awakened a desperate longing to see him again, to rebuild the family connection that had been severed by the forced removal. But she was also beginning to understand how much these hidden communities needed every person who could contribute to their survival. "I want to help here," Sarah said after a moment of consideration. "My father survived the removal and found safety in the Western Territories. These communities have no such safety, and my knowledge of white society might help protect them." Her declaration was met with nods of approval from the assembled elders, but Sarah could see that some of the younger community members remained skeptical about her commitment. She understood their concerns perfectly. She was an outsider who had appeared suddenly in their midst, bringing danger and complications they had been successfully avoiding. Rebecca Turtledove raised her hand to speak, and Nancy acknowledged her with the respect accorded to all community members regardless of age. How do we know that Sarah's knowledge is accurate? She's been living alone for 3 years, pretending to be white. Her information might be outdated or incomplete. The challenge was fair and necessary, and Sarah appreciated Rebecca's willingness to voice concerns that others might have been thinking, but were too polite to express. Trust had to be earned, not simply granted because of shared heritage or desperate circumstances. "You're right to question my knowledge," Sarah replied. "I can only tell you what I observed and experienced. You'll need to evaluate that information against your own intelligence and decide what's useful." Over the next several hours, Sarah found herself at the center of an intensive debriefing session as community leaders questioned her about every aspect of her time in white settlements. They wanted to know about military patrols, communication networks, legal procedures, economic relationships, and social attitudes that might affect Cherokee people trying to remain hidden. Some of Sarah's observations confirmed intelligence the community had already gathered through their own sources. White authorities were indeed aware that some Cherokee people remained in the mountains, and they were under increasing pressure from territorial officials to locate and remove any remaining native populations. More troubling was Sarah's report that some white settlers were actively hunting for Cherokee communities, motivated by bounties offered for information, leading to successful removals. The economic incentives created a network of informants who would report any suspicious activity to authorities. But Sarah's most valuable contribution was her detailed knowledge of how white households and communities operated on a daily basis. Her 3 years of domestic service had given her insights into white family dynamics, social hierarchies, and communication patterns that could help Cherokee people blend more effectively into white society when necessary. "The key," Sarah explained to a group of younger community members, "is understanding that white people see what they expect to see. If you dress like a servant and behave submissively, they'll assume you're supposed to be there and won't ask questions about your background." She demonstrated techniques for adopting the posture and speech patterns that would mark someone as belonging to the servant class, skills she had developed through painful trial and error during her years of hiding. The performance was convincing enough that several people commented on how completely she seemed to transform into a different person. "But the disguise only works if you never drop it," Sarah warned. "One moment of speaking Cherokee or showing knowledge you're not supposed to have, and the illusion collapses completely." As the day progressed, Sarah found herself being integrated into the community's daily routines in ways that demonstrated growing acceptance of her presence. She was assigned to work with a group of women who were processing medicinal plants, a task that required knowledge of traditional Cherokee healing practices. The work felt like returning to a part of herself that had been dormant for 3 years. Sarah's mother had been a respected healer, and she had taught her daughter to identify and prepare dozens of plants that could treat everything from minor cuts to serious illnesses. The knowledge had seemed useless during Sarah's time as a domestic servant, but here it marked her as someone with valuable skills. Rebecca Turtledove worked beside her, and their conversation gradually moved from formal politeness to genuine friendship as they discovered shared experiences and common interests. Both young women had lost family members during the removal period, and both had spent years feeling isolated from their cultural heritage. "I was only 16 when the soldiers came," Rebecca confided as they stripped bark from willow branches for pain relief medicine. "My parents and younger brother were taken to the deportation camps, but I was visiting my grandmother in a remote cabin and escaped the initial roundup." Sarah felt a familiar ache in her chest as she listened to another story of family separation and loss. "Do you know what happened to them?" "They died during the forced march west," Rebecca replied with the matter-of-fact tone that came from having processed grief for years. I received word through Cherokee people who survived the journey. My grandmother and I lived alone for 2 years before we found this community. The shared experience of loss created a bond between the two young women that went beyond simple friendship. They had both survived experiences that would have destroyed many people, and they had both found ways to preserve their Cherokee identity despite enormous pressure to abandon it entirely. As afternoon faded toward evening, the community gathered again around the central fire for their evening meal and daily discussion of important matters. Sarah noticed that she was no longer treated as a guest or outsider, but as a community member whose opinions were solicited and respected. The main topic of conversation was the development of contingency plans for responding to increased military pressure in the region. Several options were being seriously considered, each with significant advantages and serious risks. The first option involved immediate evacuation to more remote mountain locations, where the community could continue their current lifestyle with reduced risk of discovery. This approach would preserve their Cherokee identity and community structure, but it would also mean abandoning the gardens, shelters, and supply caches they had spent months developing. The second option was the document strategy Nancy had introduced the previous evening. Community members would use forged papers to claim white identities and relocate to distant states where their backgrounds could not be investigated. This approach offered the best long-term security, but it would mean permanently abandoning their Cherokee identity and dispersing the community that had become their source of strength. The third option was the most radical and dangerous. Several community members advocated for abandoning secrecy entirely and openly asserting their legal right to remain on their ancestral territory. They argued that federal treaties theoretically protected Cherokee land rights, and that a coordinated legal challenge might succeed where hiding had only provided temporary safety. Sarah listened to the debate with growing understanding of how complex their situation had become. Each option represented a different balance between security and identity, between survival and honor, between individual safety and community preservation. When Nancy asked for her opinion, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came from knowing her words might influence decisions affecting dozens of lives. "I think," she said carefully, "that we need to prepare for multiple scenarios rather than choosing a single approach." She explained her reasoning methodically, drawing on her 3 years of experience navigating hostile territory. White authorities are unpredictable. Sometimes they ignore Cherokee people who are hiding in plain sight. Other times they launch massive military operations to capture a single family. We can't know which approach they'll take, so we need to be ready for anything. Sarah proposed a strategy that combined elements of all 3 options being considered. The community would prepare evacuation routes and remote camps in case immediate retreat became necessary. They would also continue developing forged documents and white identities for community members who wanted the option of integration. Simultaneously, they would begin building connections with sympathetic white allies who might support legal challenges to removal policies. "The key is maintaining flexibility," Sarah continued. "If we commit entirely to one strategy, we become vulnerable to circumstances beyond our control. But if we prepare multiple options, we can adapt to whatever challenges emerge." The proposal generated enthusiastic discussion as community members considered how such a multi-pronged approach might work in practice. Several people contributed refinements and additional ideas that strengthened the overall strategy. Thomas Crow Killer expressed particular interest in Sarah's suggestion about building relationships with sympathetic whites. During the resistance years, your father worked successfully with white allies who opposed removal policies. Perhaps it's time to revive those connections. The conversation continued deep into the evening as the community worked to develop specific plans for implementing Sarah's strategic framework. She found herself appointed to lead a committee responsible for gathering intelligence about white attitudes and activities in the region. a role that would require her to travel periodically to nearby settlements. The assignment was both an honor and a test. By giving her significant responsibility for community security, the elders were demonstrating their trust in her judgment and commitment. But they were also placing her in a position where mistakes could have catastrophic consequences for everyone. As the formal meeting concluded and people began dispersing to their homes, William Standing Bear approached Sarah with an expression that suggested he had something important to discuss. "Walk with me," he said quietly, leading her away from the central fire toward a path that climbed toward higher ground. They walked in companionable silence through the moonlit forest until they reached a rocky outcrop that provided a clear view of the valley below. The hidden settlement was invisible from this vantage point, its carefully camouflaged buildings blending seamlessly into the natural landscape. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished today," William said finally. "You've gone from being someone who needed rescue to someone who can help rescue others." Sarah felt tears threatening as she thought about her father and wondered if she would ever see him again. "Do you really think there's no way to get word to him? He must believe I'm dead." "Communication with the Western Territories is dangerous, but not impossible," William replied carefully. "There are Cherokee traders who move between the removal settlements and the hidden communities. Messages can be carried, though it might take months for them to reach their destination." The possibility of sending word to her father filled Sarah with excitement, but she was also aware that such communication carried enormous risks for everyone involved. What would happen if a message was intercepted? It would confirm the existence of Cherokee communities in Tennessee and probably trigger the largest military operation in the region's history. William said bluntly, "Every hidden settlement would be at risk." Sarah understood immediately why the community leaders had been reluctant to discuss this option during the general meeting. The desire to reunite families was powerful, but it had to be balanced against the survival needs of entire communities. "I won't ask anyone to take that risk for my personal needs," Sarah said firmly. "My father survived the removal. These communities have no such guarantee of safety." William's smile was barely visible in the moonlight, but Sarah could hear approval in his voice. "That decision confirms everything I hoped about your character. Your father raised you to think about community welfare rather than personal desires." They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over the sleeping valley where Cherokee people were living freely in their ancestral territory, despite every effort to drive them away. The scene was peaceful, but Sarah was increasingly aware of how fragile that peace might be. "Tomorrow I'll begin visiting white settlements to gather intelligence," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "The work your community has asked me to do is important, and I want to prove that your trust is justified." "Be careful," William warned. "Your face is known in Millfield, and word of the auction will have spread to neighboring communities. Your Cherokee identity is no longer secret." Sarah nodded, understanding the dangers she would face, but also recognizing the value of the information she could gather. Her 3 years of experience living among white settlers had given her insights that could help protect Cherokee communities throughout the region. As they walked back toward the settlement, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in her life over the past 2 days. She had gone from being a powerless servant, facing years of indentured servitude, to being a valued member of a Cherokee community with significant responsibilities for their collective security. The transformation was almost overwhelming, but it also felt like the natural result of finally being in a place where her true identity was known and valued. For 3 years, she had hidden her Cherokee heritage because it was seen as a liability. Now she was among people who recognized that heritage as a source of strength and wisdom. Back at her cabin, Sarah spent the evening preparing for her new role as an intelligence gatherer for the community. She studied maps of the region, memorized the names and locations of white settlements, and planned cover stories that would allow her to move freely through hostile territory. The work was dangerous and complex, but it was also deeply satisfying, in ways that domestic service had never been. For the first time since her mother's death, Sarah was using her intelligence and skills for purposes that mattered to her personally. She was no longer just surviving. She was contributing to the survival of her people. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah thought about the young woman who had stood on the auction platform just 2 days earlier, convinced that her life was effectively over. That woman had been defined by what she lacked, by the ways she had been damaged and diminished by circumstances beyond her control. The woman who now lay down to sleep in a Cherokee community was defined by what she could offer, by the knowledge and skills that made her valuable to people she cared about. The change was more than circumstantial. It was fundamental transformation. From victim to agent, from burden to asset, from isolation to belonging. Outside her window, the night sounds of the forest created a symphony that had provided comfort to Cherokee people for countless generations. Somewhere in the darkness, guards maintained their vigilant watch over a community that refused to surrender its right to exist. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers, but tonight Sarah Raven Feather Blackbird was exactly where she belonged, among her people, in the mountains that had always been their home. The morning fog clung to the Tennessee valleys, like the breath of restless spirits, but Sarah could sense something different in the air as she prepared for her third intelligence-gathering mission in 2 weeks. The forest seemed unusually quiet, with none of the birdsong that typically accompanied dawn in the mountains. Even the insects had fallen silent, creating an ominous stillness that made the hair on her arms stand upright. Sarah had just finished braiding her hair in the simple style favored by white servant girls when Rebecca Turtle Dove burst through her cabin door without the courtesy of knocking. The younger woman's face was flushed with exertion and fear, and her breathing suggested she had been running hard through difficult terrain. "Soldiers," Rebecca gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "Major Davidson from Fort Campbell. 3 companies. They're moving up the valley from Millfield, searching every hollow and ridge." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow, confirming the fears that had been growing in the community for weeks. Ever since her dramatic rescue at the auction, territorial authorities had been under increasing pressure to locate and remove any remaining Cherokee populations in eastern Tennessee. Now it appeared that pressure had finally translated into direct military action. How far away? Sarah asked, already moving to gather the emergency supplies she kept ready for immediate evacuation. 6 miles, maybe 7, Rebecca replied, her voice steadying as she focused on delivering crucial information. "But they're moving fast and they have Cherokee trackers with them. Collaborators who know these mountains almost as well as we do." The mention of Cherokee collaborators sent a chill through Sarah's chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. The forced removal had divided Cherokee communities, creating desperate people who were willing to betray their own families in exchange for better treatment from white authorities. These collaborators were more dangerous than any white soldiers because they understood Cherokee hiding techniques and could recognize signs that others would miss entirely. Sarah and Rebecca ran toward the community's central gathering area, where they found organized chaos as families implemented the evacuation procedures they had rehearsed countless times over the past weeks. Children were being gathered into groups led by older siblings, while adults collected essential supplies and prepared to abandon everything they had built in the hidden settlement. Nancy Ridge Walker stood at the center of the activity, her calm voice providing direction and reassurance to people whose lives were about to be uprooted once again. Despite her advanced age, she moved with the efficiency of someone who had survived multiple forced relocations and understood exactly what needed to be accomplished in the limited time available. "Sarah," Nancy called out as she spotted the young woman approaching. "We need you to take the mountain trail to Pine Ridge Settlement and warn the Johnson family. They have 3 small children and won't be able to move as quickly as the rest of us." The assignment was both an honor and a death sentence. Reaching Pine Ridge Settlement would require Sarah to travel through territory that would soon be crawling with soldiers and Cherokee collaborators. If she was captured, her public identification at the Millfield auction would mark her as a high-value target whose interrogation could expose every hidden Cherokee community in the region. "I leave immediately," Sarah replied without hesitation. The Johnson family included 2 children under the age of 5, and their capture would provide authorities with powerful leverage for forcing other Cherokee people to surrender. William, standing bare, appeared beside them, his weathered face grave with the knowledge of how desperate their situation had become. "The soldiers aren't just conducting a routine sweep," he reported. "They have specific intelligence about our locations and numbers. Someone has been providing them with detailed information." The revelation that they were facing a coordinated betrayal rather than random military pressure changed everything about their tactical situation. Random searches could be evaded through careful movement and concealment, but targeted operations based on inside knowledge were exponentially more dangerous. Who could have such information? Sarah asked, though part of her was already beginning to suspect the answer. "Someone who has been watching our communities for weeks or months," Thomas Crow Killer said grimly. "Someone who knows our routines, our numbers, and our defensive preparations." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized the implications of what Thomas was suggesting. The hidden Cherokee communities had been infiltrated by someone they trusted, someone who had been gathering intelligence while pretending to be an ally or community member. "We can't worry about identifying the traitor now," Nancy said firmly. "Our immediate priority is evacuating everyone to the emergency camps before the soldiers arrive. Sarah, you need to leave for Pine Ridge immediately. Every minute of delay increases the danger for the Johnson family." Sarah grabbed her emergency pack and the forged documents that would allow her to claim white identity if questioned by authorities. The papers identified her as Mary Henderson, a domestic servant traveling between households in search of employment. The story was simple enough to be believable and common enough to avoid attracting special attention. As Sarah prepared to leave the settlement, she was approached by a boy of perhaps 12 years old who pressed a small leather pouch into her hands. "For the journey," he said simply before disappearing back into the crowd of evacuating families. Opening the pouch, Sarah found a collection of traditional Cherokee travel foods, high-energy mixtures of nuts, dried fruit, and meat that could sustain a person for days without cooking or preparation. The gift was both practical and symbolic, representing the community's faith in her mission and their determination to maintain their cultural traditions, even under the most desperate circumstances. The trail to Pine Ridge Settlement wound through some of the most rugged terrain in the Tennessee mountains, following deer paths and abandoned logging roads that provided concealment at the cost of difficult travel. Sarah moved as quickly as she dared, balancing speed against the need to avoid detection by military patrols that might already be in the area. After 2 hours of hard travel, she encountered the first signs that soldiers were indeed moving through the region in force. Fresh horse tracks marked the muddy trail, too numerous and organized to belong to civilian travelers. More ominously, she found evidence of a hastily abandoned campsite where someone had been watching the trail from concealment. The discovery confirmed that the military operation was more sophisticated than a simple search and destroy mission. Advanced scouts were already positioned throughout the mountains, gathering intelligence and monitoring escape routes that Cherokee communities might use during evacuation efforts. Sarah adjusted her route to avoid areas where soldiers were most likely to establish observation posts, but the detour added precious time to her journey. By midday, she was still 3 miles from Pine Ridge Settlement, and she could hear the distant sound of dogs barking in patterns that suggested organized search activities. The use of tracking dogs represented a terrifying escalation in the military pressure facing Cherokee communities. Dogs could follow scent trails that were hours or even days old, making concealment exponentially more difficult and forcing evacuating families to move much faster than would normally be safe. When Sarah finally reached the ridge overlooking Pine Ridge settlement, what she saw below filled her with despair and rage. The small cluster of cabins that housed the Johnson family and 3 other Cherokee households was already surrounded by soldiers. Blue uniformed figures moved through the buildings with the systematic efficiency of troops conducting a planned operation rather than a chance discovery. Through her concealed position in the trees, Sarah could see Cherokee families being forced from their homes at gunpoint. Adults were being separated from children, and personal belongings were being searched for anything that might provide information about other hidden communities. The scene was a nightmare made manifest, everything that Cherokee people had been desperately trying to avoid since the forced removal began. Most heartbreaking of all was the sight of the Johnson family being loaded into a military wagon along with their 3 small children. Sarah could see 5-year-old Jenny Johnson clinging to her mother's skirts while 2-year-old Peter cried with the desperate wails of a child who understood that something terrible was happening but could not comprehend what or why. Sarah watched in helpless fury as the soldiers prepared to transport their captives toward the deportation camps where Cherokee people were held before being forced west to the Indian Territory. She knew that families who entered those camps had little chance of remaining together, and that many would not survive the harsh conditions and brutal treatment that characterized the removal process. The military operation below was being supervised by a tall officer whose bearing and uniform marked him as the Major Davidson that Rebecca had mentioned. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that he conducted the arrests with the cold efficiency of someone who viewed Cherokee people as problems to be solved rather than human beings with rights and dignity. But what filled Sarah with the deepest rage was the presence of 2 Cherokee men who were clearly collaborating with the soldiers. She could see them pointing out hidden caches of food and supplies, identifying family relationships among the captives, and providing information that would help authorities locate other Cherokee communities. The sight of Cherokee people betraying their own families for whatever rewards the soldiers had promised them was almost too painful to bear. Sarah understood the desperation that might drive someone to such collaboration, but she also knew that the information these men provided would result in the capture and suffering of countless innocent people. As the military convoy prepared to leave Pine Ridge settlement with their Cherokee captives, Sarah faced a decision that would define her character and her future. She could retreat to warn the other hidden communities about the extent of military activity in the region, or she could attempt to gather intelligence about the soldiers, plans and capabilities that might help Cherokee communities mount more effective resistance. Both options carried enormous risks, but Sarah realized that her unique position as someone who could pass for white while understanding Cherokee needs gave her opportunities that no one else possessed. The information she might gather could save dozens of families from the fate that had just befallen the Johnson household. Sarah began following the military convoy at a distance, using her knowledge of the terrain to maintain visual contact while avoiding detection. The soldiers moved with the confidence of troops operating in controlled territory, but they also maintained security procedures that suggested they expected potential resistance from Cherokee fighters. The convoy's destination became clear as they descended toward the main valley road that connected Millfield with Fort Campbell. Major Davidson was taking his captives directly to the military installation where Cherokee prisoners were processed before being shipped west to the Indian Territory. But Sarah also noticed something that gave her a glimmer of hope. The soldiers were moving slowly to accommodate the military wagons carrying their prisoners, and they were following predictable routes that could potentially be ambushed by Cherokee fighters with sufficient preparation and coordination. More importantly, Sarah could see that the convoy was smaller than it appeared from a distance. Major Davidson had brought 3 companies of soldiers to the mountains, but he was using only one company to escort the captured families back to Fort Campbell. The other 2 companies were apparently remaining in the mountains to continue their search operations. The intelligence was valuable, but it also revealed how desperate the situation had become for Cherokee communities throughout the region. If soldiers were remaining in the mountains for extended operations, the hidden settlements would not be able to simply wait for the military pressure to pass. They would need to either evacuate to much more remote locations or find ways to actively resist the ongoing search efforts. As afternoon faded toward evening, Sarah made the difficult decision to break off her surveillance of the military convoy and begin the dangerous journey back to warn the other Cherokee communities about what she had witnessed. The information she carried was too important to risk losing through capture, and every hour of delay increased the danger for families who might still be trying to evacuate their settlements. The return journey was a nightmare of careful movement through terrain that was now actively patrolled by hostile forces. Twice Sarah was forced to hide while soldiers passed within yards of her concealed position, and once she had to make a desperate detour when tracking dogs picked up her scent and began following her trail. By the time she reached the emergency gathering point where the scattered Cherokee communities were supposed to rendezvous, Sarah was exhausted and dehydrated, but alive and carrying intelligence that could help determine their collective response to the military threat they faced. The emergency gathering point was a natural amphitheater hidden deep in the mountains, surrounded by caves and defensive positions that had been prepared months earlier for exactly this kind of crisis. Sarah found about 60 Cherokee people from various communities, representing perhaps half of the total population that had been living in hidden settlements throughout the region. The mood in the gathering was grim but determined, reflecting people who had survived too much to be easily broken by new challenges. Families sat around small, carefully concealed fires, sharing food and information while children played quiet games that would not attract unwanted attention. Nancy Ridge Walker approached Sarah as soon as she arrived, her expression reflecting both relief at seeing the young woman alive and anxiety about what news she might be carrying. "The Johnson family?" she asked quietly. "Captured," Sarah replied, her voice heavy with the weight of failure. "All of them. The soldiers were already there when I arrived." The confirmation of their worst fears sent a ripple of grief and anger through the assembled Cherokee people. The Johnson family had been beloved members of their extended community, and their capture represented a devastating blow to morale as well as a significant loss of people who could contribute to their collective survival. "But I gathered intelligence about military operations that might help us respond," Sarah continued, struggling to find hope in the midst of tragedy. "The soldiers are divided into 3 companies, and only one is being used for prisoner transport. The other 2 are remaining in the mountains for extended search operations." William Standing Bear leaned forward with interest. "How extended?" "Based on their supply loads and defensive preparations, I would estimate at least 2 weeks," Sarah replied. "They're not planning a quick sweep. They intend to systematically search every valley and ridge until they find all the hidden communities." The intelligence prompted an immediate strategy session as Cherokee leaders debated their limited options for responding to sustained military pressure. Some advocated for immediate evacuation to even more remote locations, while others argued for actively resisting the search operations through guerrilla tactics. Thomas Crow Killer emerged as the strongest voice for armed resistance, arguing that Cherokee communities had both the legal right and practical ability to defend their ancestral territory against illegal military operations. Federal treaties guarantee our right to remain on these lands, he declared. "We have the moral authority to resist, and we have the tactical knowledge to make resistance effective." But Nancy Ridge Walker expressed deep concerns about the consequences of open conflict with federal troops. "Armed resistance will bring overwhelming military response," she warned. "We might win a few battles, but we will lose the war, and our people will suffer for our defiance." Sarah listened to the debate with growing understanding of how impossible their situation had become. Every option available to them carried terrible risks, and every choice would require sacrificing something essential to their survival or their identity as Cherokee people. As the discussion continued deep into the night, Sarah found herself thinking about the children she had seen loaded into military wagons, about families torn apart by forces beyond their control, about Cherokee people forced to collaborate with their own oppressors out of desperation or fear. The image that haunted her most was the sight of little Jenny Johnson clinging to her mother while soldiers prepared to transport them toward an uncertain fate in the Western Territories. That 5-year-old girl represented everything Cherokee communities were fighting to protect, and her capture demonstrated how high the stakes had become. When Nancy finally called for a decision about their collective response to the military threat, Sarah surprised herself by requesting permission to speak. The assembled Cherokee people turned their attention to the young woman who had risked her life to gather intelligence about their enemies. "I believe we need to think beyond simple survival," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the natural amphitheater. "We need to find ways to rescue the families who have already been captured, not just protect ourselves from future raids." The proposal sent shocked murmurs through the gathered Cherokee people. Attempting to rescue prisoners from military custody was exponentially more dangerous than simply evading capture, and it would certainly provoke the massive retaliation that everyone was trying to avoid. "The Johnson family and others like them are depending on us," Sarah continued. "If we abandon them to save ourselves, we become no better than the collaborators who betrayed them in the first place." Thomas Crow Killer nodded approvingly. "Sarah speaks wisdom. Cherokee people do not abandon their own, no matter how difficult the rescue might be. But the practical challenges of mounting rescue operations against federal troops were staggering. Fort Campbell was heavily defended, and any attempt to liberate Cherokee prisoners would require careful planning, significant manpower, and coordination between scattered communities that were struggling simply to avoid detection. Even if we could mount successful rescue operations, Rebecca Turtle Dove pointed out, what would we do with the liberated families? They couldn't return to hidden settlements that are actively being searched by soldiers." Sarah had been thinking about this problem during her journey back from Pine Ridge Settlement, and she believed she had identified a potential solution that no one had yet considered. "We evacuate them to Cherokee communities in North Carolina," she said. "Communities that have legal recognition and federal protection." The suggestion was met with stunned silence as people processed the implications of what Sarah was proposing. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina had managed to avoid removal through legal challenges and political maneuvering, and they maintained reservation lands where Cherokee people could live openly without fear of deportation. Getting captured families to North Carolina would require moving them through hundreds of miles of hostile territory. William Standing Bear observed, "The risks would be enormous." "So are the risks of leaving them in deportation camps," Sarah replied firmly. "At least this way, they would have a chance for freedom and safety." The debate that followed was intense and emotional, reflecting fundamental disagreements about the responsibilities Cherokee communities had toward each other and the risks they were willing to accept in fulfilling those responsibilities. But gradually, a consensus began to emerge around the idea that some form of rescue operation was both morally necessary and tactically feasible. By dawn, the assembled Cherokee people had agreed to attempt a coordinated rescue of captured families, followed by evacuation to the legal Cherokee reservation in North Carolina. The operation would require unprecedented cooperation between scattered communities and would expose everyone involved to terrible dangers. But it would also represent the kind of unified resistance that Cherokee people had not mounted since the initial opposition to removal policies years earlier. For the first time since Sarah's rescue at the Millfield auction, Cherokee communities would be taking offensive action rather than simply trying to hide from their enemies. As the sun rose over the Tennessee mountains, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration at the magnitude of what they were planning to attempt. The operation would either save dozens of Cherokee families or result in the destruction of every remaining Native community in the region. But she also knew that the little girl clinging to her mother in that military wagon deserved every risk they were prepared to take. Cherokee people had survived too much to abandon their own children to the mercy of enemies who viewed them as obstacles rather than human beings. The war for Cherokee survival was about to begin in earnest, and Sarah Raven Feather Blackbird would stand at the center of a battle that would determine whether her people had any future in the land of their ancestors. The morning mist had not yet lifted from the valley floor when Sarah led a group of 20 Cherokee warriors through the forest toward Fort Campbell, their faces painted with the ancient symbols their grandfathers had worn into battle against enemies who threatened their people. Each warrior carried weapons both traditional and modern, tomahawks alongside rifles, bows beside ammunition pouches, representing a fusion of old ways and new necessities that defined their struggle for survival. Sarah moved at the front of the group, no longer the frightened girl who had stood on an auction platform weeks earlier, but a war leader whose knowledge of white military tactics had earned the respect of seasoned fighters twice her age. The transformation was complete and irreversible. She had become exactly what her people needed in this desperate hour. The rescue plan they were implementing was audacious in its scope and timing. While Major Davidson's soldiers continued their mountain sweeps, believing they had the Cherokee communities scattered and helpless, those same communities were preparing to strike at the very heart of the military operation. Fort Campbell housed not only the Johnson family, but 17 other Cherokee captives, including 8 children under the age of 10. Intelligence gathered by Cherokee scouts had revealed that the fort's garrison was operating at minimum strength, with most troops deployed in the mountains for search operations. The timing would never be better, but it would also never be more dangerous. If the rescue failed, every Cherokee person in eastern Tennessee would face the full fury of federal military retaliation. As they approached the outer perimeter of Fort Campbell, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with leading people into battle for the first time in her life. Each warrior following her had chosen to risk everything based on her assessment of their chances for success. If her intelligence was wrong, if her tactical planning was flawed, these brave people would pay with their lives. The fort itself was a modest frontier installation, built more for administrative functions than serious military defense. Wooden palisades surrounded a collection of buildings that included barracks, officer quarters, a commissary, and the makeshift prison, where Cherokee captives were being held pending deportation. Guard towers at the corners provided observation points, but they were manned by soldiers who were not expecting coordinated assault from people they considered defeated and scattered. Sarah's plan relied on surprise, speed, and the kind of intimate knowledge of Cherokee captives that only someone who understood both cultures could provide. While the main force created diversions and engaged the garrison troops, a smaller group would infiltrate the prison compound and evacuate the families before reinforcements could arrive from the mountain search operations. The attack began at dawn with Cherokee warriors emerging from the morning mist like vengeful spirits, their war cries echoing off the fort's wooden walls with a sound that had not been heard in these mountains for decades. The psychological impact on garrison soldiers was immediate and devastating. Men who had been conducting routine morning duties suddenly found themselves under assault from enemies they thought they had already defeated. Sarah led the infiltration team toward the prison compound while explosions and gunfire erupted throughout the fort. The diversionary attacks were working perfectly, drawing defenders away from the areas where Cherokee families were being held and creating the chaos necessary for a successful rescue operation. The prison building was a hastily constructed wooden structure with barred windows and a single heavily guarded entrance. Sarah could see Cherokee faces pressed against those windows, adults and children who had been trying to stay strong while facing an uncertain future in the Western Territories. Their eyes widened with recognition and hope as they spotted Cherokee warriors moving purposefully toward their rescue. Breaking down the prison door required precious seconds that felt like hours while battle raged around them. But Cherokee warriors had brought tools specifically designed for this purpose. As the heavy wooden barriers splintered and fell, Sarah heard the voices of Cherokee children calling out in their native language, words of joy and relief that made all the risks worthwhile. The evacuation proceeded with military precision, as Cherokee families were quickly organized into groups that could move efficiently through the chaos of the battle-torn fort. Sarah personally carried 2-year-old Peter Johnson while his mother gathered their few possessions and prepared for the desperate flight that would carry them toward freedom. But as the rescue operation reached its climax, Sarah heard a sound that chilled her to the bone. Military trumpets were sounding in the distance, calling troops back from their mountain operations. Major Davidson had realized what was happening and was recalling his scattered forces to mount a coordinated pursuit of the escaping Cherokee families. The race for survival had begun, and it would be decided in the forests and valleys where Cherokee people had always found sanctuary from their enemies. Sarah led the combined group of warriors and rescued families toward predetermined rally points where horses and supplies waited to carry them on the next phase of their journey toward the North Carolina reservation. Behind them, Fort Campbell burned with fires set by Cherokee warriors who understood that destroying military supplies and communications equipment would slow the inevitable pursuit. The smoke rising into the morning sky served as both a signal of their success and a warning that federal retaliation would be swift and merciless. As they moved through familiar terrain toward the first checkpoint, Sarah found herself running beside 5-year-old Jenny Johnson, whose small legs were struggling to keep pace with the adults around her. Without hesitation, Sarah swept the child into her arms and continued running, feeling the weight of responsibility for this innocent life whose future depended on their successful escape. The first day of their flight was a nightmare of constant movement through difficult terrain while staying ahead of pursuing soldiers, who knew these mountains almost as well as the Cherokee people did. Military patrols were converging from multiple directions, creating a closing net that threatened to trap the entire group in the valley system south of Fort Campbell. But Sarah's knowledge of white military tactics proved invaluable in predicting the movements of their pursuers and identifying routes that would avoid the most dangerous areas. She led the group through stream beds that would confuse tracking dogs, across rocky ground that would not hold clear footprints, and through dense forest where military horses could not follow effectively. By nightfall of the first day, they had covered 20 miles and reached a prepared camp where Cherokee allies had cached supplies and fresh horses for the continuing journey. The rescued families were exhausted but determined, understanding that their freedom depended on reaching the safety of the North Carolina reservation before military forces could overtake them. During the brief rest at the supply camp, Sarah took time to speak with the Johnson family and the other rescued captives about what lay ahead. The journey to North Carolina would require several more days of hard travel through territory where they could expect continued pursuit and the constant risk of betrayal by civilian informants. "Will we really be safe when we reach the reservation?" Mary Johnson asked, holding her sleeping children close while her husband stood guard at the camp's perimeter. "Safer than anywhere else we could go," Sarah replied honestly. "The Eastern Band has legal protection that other Cherokee communities lack, and they have the resources to help families establish new lives." But Sarah also knew that reaching the reservation was only the beginning of a new set of challenges for the rescued families. They would be starting over with nothing, dependent on the charity of Cherokee communities that were already struggling to support their own people. The adjustment would be difficult, But it would also represent genuine freedom for the first time since the removal policies began. The second day of their flight brought new dangers as military pursuit intensified and civilian bounty hunters joined the search for Cherokee refugees. Sarah was forced to split the group into smaller units that could move more quickly and present less obvious targets for their enemies. The strategy increased their chances of getting some families to safety, but it also meant that Sarah could not personally protect everyone who depended on her leadership. As they approached the North Carolina border, Sarah encountered the most unexpected challenge of their entire journey. A group of Cherokee collaborators, led by one of the men she had seen at Pine Ridge Settlement, blocked their path with demands that the rescued families surrender voluntarily in exchange for promises of better treatment. The confrontation was heartbreaking because it represented the deepest divisions that removal policies had created within Cherokee communities. Desperate people were being forced to choose between betraying their own families and watching their children starve in hiding. Sarah understood the motivations that drove such collaboration, but she also knew that surrendering now would doom the rescued families to deportation and permanent separation. "You cannot reach the reservation," the lead collaborator insisted, his voice carrying the defeat of someone who had already given up hope. "The soldiers are waiting for you at every crossing point. Surrender now, and they have promised that families will not be separated during the removal process." Sarah looked at the Cherokee families clustered behind her, seeing in their faces the same determination that had carried their ancestors through countless challenges over thousands of years. These people had already survived capture, imprisonment, and a daring rescue operation. They were not about to surrender their freedom based on promises from people who had consistently broken every agreement they had ever made with Cherokee communities. "We do not surrender," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying across the forest, clearing with absolute conviction. "We do not abandon our children to the mercy of people who see them as obstacles rather than human beings." The words seemed to resonate with something deep in the hearts of even the collaborators, several of whom stepped aside to allow the rescued families to pass. The power of refusing to accept defeat, of insisting on the right to determine their own destiny, proved stronger than fear or desperation. As they crossed into North Carolina territory, Sarah felt something shift in the quality of the air around them. This was still Cherokee land, but it was Cherokee land where her people lived openly and legally, where children could speak their native language without fear, where families could practice their traditions without hiding from hostile authorities. The final approach to the Eastern Band Reservation was marked by encounters with Cherokee scouts who provided both security and guidance for the final stages of their journey. These were Cherokee people who had never been forced from their ancestral territory, who had found ways to maintain their communities and their culture despite enormous external pressure. When Sarah finally led the rescued families into the main settlement of the Eastern Band, she was greeted by Cherokee leaders who had been monitoring their progress and preparing to receive refugees from the Tennessee mountains. The welcome was warm and immediate, reflecting the understanding that all Cherokee people shared responsibility for each other's welfare regardless of which specific community they had originally called home. The celebration that followed was subdued but deeply meaningful, honoring the courage of the warriors who had mounted the rescue operation and the resilience of the families who had survived capture and escape. But it was also a mourning ceremony for the Cherokee communities that had been destroyed in Tennessee and the people who had not survived to reach safety. As Sarah stood before the assembled Cherokee people and recounted the story of their struggle and escape, she realized that her own transformation was finally complete. The frightened girl who had been sold at auction for $1 no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had led her people through their darkest hour and brought them safely to a place where they could rebuild their lives in freedom. The Eastern Band leaders formally welcomed the rescued families into their community and began the process of helping them establish new homes and livelihoods. Children who had been traumatized by capture and imprisonment began to smile again, as they discovered playmates who spoke their language and understood their experiences. Most remarkably, word began to arrive that other Cherokee communities throughout the southeastern mountains were organizing similar rescue operations, inspired by the success at Fort Campbell. The network of hidden settlements that had seemed so isolated and vulnerable was revealing itself to be part of a larger resistance movement that refused to accept the finality of removal policies. Sarah spent her first weeks in North Carolina helping the rescued families adjust to their new circumstances while also serving as a liaison between the Eastern Band and the continuing Cherokee resistance in Tennessee. Her unique knowledge of both white society and Cherokee survival strategies made her invaluable for coordinating support for communities that were still fighting to remain in their ancestral territory. But the most meaningful moments for Sarah came when she was simply able to watch Cherokee children playing freely in the sunlight, speaking their native language without fear, learning the traditional songs and stories that connected them to their ancestors. The sight of 5-year-old Jenny Johnson laughing as she played with other Cherokee children represented everything that the rescue operation had been designed to protect. One evening, as Sarah sat by the fire listening to Cherokee elders share the ancient stories that preserved their people's history and wisdom, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 weeks earlier, she had been a broken woman with no family, no community, and no hope for the future. Tonight, she was surrounded by her people in a place where Cherokee culture thrived, and Cherokee children could grow up knowing who they were and where they came from. The transformation was so complete that Sarah sometimes wondered if the desperate woman on the auction platform had been a different person entirely. But she knew that every experience from those dark years had been necessary preparation for the role she had ultimately been called to play in her people's survival. As winter settled over the North Carolina mountains, Sarah received the news she had been hoping for since her rescue from the Millfield auction. A message had arrived from Oklahoma Territory, carried by Cherokee traders who moved between the various scattered communities. Her father was alive and well, serving as a leader in the Western Cherokee communities, and he had never stopped believing that his daughter had survived the destruction of their original community. The letter from Joseph Blackbird was brief, but filled with the love and pride of a father who had learned that his child had not only survived, but had become a leader in the struggle to preserve Cherokee communities in their ancestral territory. He expressed his hope that they would be reunited someday, but also his understanding that Sarah's work with the Eastern Band was too important to abandon for personal desires. Reading her father's words by firelight in a Cherokee community where she was honored and respected, Sarah understood that her mother's dying instructions to forget her Cherokee identity had been both necessary and temporary. There had been a time when hiding her heritage was essential for survival, but that time had passed. Now her Cherokee identity was the source of her strength and the foundation of her service to her people. The woman who had once been sold for $1 had become priceless to the Cherokee community she served. Her story would be told around fires for generations, inspiring other Cherokee people to never accept defeat, never abandon hope, and never forget that their greatest strength came from their commitment to each other and their determination to preserve their way of life for future generations. Sarah Raven Feather Blackbird had found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she belonged, among her people, in the mountains where her ancestors had lived for thousands of years, working to ensure that Cherokee children would always have a home where they could grow up free and proud of who they were. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.